Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into some, well, pretty foundational stuff, excerpts from Hegel's The Science of Logic.
Yeah, Hegel, The Science of Logic.
Yeah.
Now, I know those two together, logic and Hegel, might make some people think like dusty old textbooks, right? But that's not what we're doing here. We're going to unearth the surprisingly relevant core insights from this, philosophical giant. It's like offering you a shortcut.
The shortcut.
To understanding really, really powerful ideas about how knowledge itself actually works, how we know things.
Exactly. So, think of this deep dive as your express pass to, grasping Hegel's fundamental, concepts about logic. Okay, so what is it? What is logic? How is it connected to reality? And how does thought itself, how do our thought processes, how do they actually work? That's what we're going to get into. We're going to extract these, little nuggets.
Yeah, nuggets of wisdom from Hegel. Yeah, essential nuggets from these really complex texts. So
yeah,
you can leave with a much clearer understanding of some really profound philosophical territory.
Okay, so we're diving into excerpts like we always do from a major work of philosophy. We're going to extract the key information and then we're going to kind of have a conversation about it.
Right.
One of the things that strikes me right away is Hegel's perspective on logic itself. It's not a thing you just learn, before getting to the real philosophy,
Oh, absolutely not. For Hegel, logic is the bedrock and the final product. It's both of his entire philosophical system.
Yeah.
So it's not just the entry point. It's the very foundation that everything else is built on, and the final destination of philosophical inquiry.
That's a huge claim, right? I mean, it makes me think of Kant's transcendental logic. Do you know what I mean? When Kant's trying to map out the structure of how we can even perceive and understand the world at all.
Yeah, there's a similarity there for sure with Kant.
Yeah.
Both are really interested in the architecture of our conceptual landscape. So just as Kant's categories define what makes an object, recognizable to us as an object, Hegel's logic, it lays bare this structure, this fundamental conceptual space. But here's a key difference. For Hegel, this space isn't just about understanding these static objects. It's the living medium through which spirit is interpreting nature, seeing nature in a way as its own earlier form, and ultimately transforming that nature into I love this phrase, a meaning-generating community, he calls it.
A meaning-generating community. I mean, that's some poetic language right there.
It is.
Okay, so it's through this Hegelian logic that we, as thinking beings, make sense of the natural world and our place in it.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the role of the philosopher in all this.
Yes. So the philosopher plays this really crucial role for Hegel. The philosopher is the one who brings this underlying logic to light, right? Articulating it, making it a matter of conscious reflection. So in a way, the philosopher's work, this very system of logic, it's both the starting point of our philosophical journey and the ultimate, achievement.
That is fascinating. That we also encountered this idea of mental space.
Yes.
Particularly in relation to Kant. So can you break that down for us a little bit?
So Kant, he really shifted things, right? He started considering experience from the subject's point of view. You're emphasizing this mental space.
Yeah.
That we each bring to our experiences as the fundamental organizing principle. This mental space, how our source kind of describes it, it's really a metaphor, right? For all the ways we represent things to ourselves, either through imagination or through these abstract concepts. It allows things to kind of become present to our minds as objects that we can then think about. So it's the a priori. So it's the before experience that shapes how we even have experience.
So it's the framework that our minds bring before we even encounter the world.
Yeah.
For any kind of experience. And Kant, he differentiated between different types of this mental space.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. So he distinguished between this space that's shaped by our senses, which is kind of bodily. It's a kind of bodily, intuitive a priori, right?
Yeah.
Through which objects are immediately given to us. And then a logical space, which is this is the result of our reflective thinking. So this is what defines what the concept of an object, in general, even means.
Yeah.
This logical space kind of sets the minimum criteria for something to be recognized as an object when our senses then present it to us.
Yeah.
So Kant's famous categories, right? Those are the specific ways in which this general concept of an object is structured.
So how do we know that that these categories are actually working? Like, how do we know they're like successfully defining a recognizable object for us?
So Kant's test for this is whether a subject, by using these categories, right, to organize the otherwise jumbled information that we get from our senses, can maintain a consistent sense of I throughout their experience. Like, can you distinguish yourself as the one having the experience from the things that you are experiencing? Think about it like navigating a crowded room. You need to be able to keep track of yourself, right?
Yeah.
As distinct from all the other people in the room. So this ability to maintain your self-identity while you're experiencing the world, this is key to Kant's idea of objectivity.
That makes sense. Like the very fundamental ability to say, this is me and that is not me, right? And it's not just about passively observing the world either, right? It's about our actions, our values, like this mental space. It applies to those things as well.
Exactly. So the self isn't just this blank slate receiving information. It's also an active agent, right?
Yeah.
Like a generator of values and choices. And this leads to what Kant called the space of reason. Where we contemplate possibilities, what would have to be the case, what ought to be the case. This is where like moral obligations come into play. So it's a kind of moral dimension of this inherent mental framework.
Okay. So that's Kant. Now, how does Hegel, how does he kind of take this and build upon it or diverge from it? This understanding of a priori and a posteriori knowledge.
Well, Hegel, he's moving towards what he calls a full-blown idealism, right?
Yep.
And he argues that a priori and a posteriori aren't fundamentally different kinds of knowledge. Instead, he sees them as like two sides of the same coin. They differ only in how we arrive at them. It's a more unified view, where our experience and our like pre-existing conceptual framework are deeply and inextricably linked. They're not separate things.
Interesting. So the division isn't as clear-cut as we might initially think. Now, Hegel also seems to have some criticisms of what he refers to as abstract reflection and formal categories. What's his issue with those? What's going on there?
So he contends that treating concepts as like mere empty forms, detached from their specific content, ultimately makes them limited and inadequate for grasping the truth, which he believes is inherently like infinite and dynamic.
Yeah.
He says that he uses the term healthy common sense, and he says that this often just instinctively rejects these empty logical categories, right? It senses that there's no real substance there. Think about, endlessly repeating like a car is a car, it feels kind of hollow because it doesn't tell you anything meaningful about the specific car you might be thinking of.
Right, like it's true, but it doesn't give you any actual information. But Hegel also cautions against completely dismissing these thought determinations, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He says that if you reject these thought frameworks entirely, you can kind of become trapped by unclarified and therefore unfree thought, he says. So even though common sense might intuitively dismiss seemingly empty logical principles, like the law of identity, A equals A, or the principle of contradiction, Hegel sees their basic, although limited, role in how we process information.
So what about inference rules, those logical steps that we take to draw conclusions? How does he view those?
Well, he acknowledges their place in our thinking and reasoning processes, but he also points out that common sense has this valid realization that these rules, they're indifferent to the actual truth of the matter, especially when it comes to, he says, higher truth, like, spiritual or religious understanding. These rules, they primarily deal with the correctness or the validity of our reasoning, but not necessarily the ultimate truth of the ideas themselves. So you can follow all the logical rules perfectly and still arrive at a false conclusion if the initial assumptions that you started with were wrong.
Right, the logic could be perfect but still lead you astray if you're starting from the wrong place.
Exactly.
Okay, so for Hegel then, logic needs to go beyond these like empty forms and rules.
Yeah.
So what does he propose as the true subject matter of logic? What does he want us to focus on?
So for Hegel, logic, it shifts its focus from simply examining things to examining the concept of the things. So he emphasizes that a concept, it's not something that we can directly, sense or imagine. It's a product and content of thought. It's the logos. It's the very reason of that which is. It's the underlying truth or essence of what we call things. It's this dynamic concept that he believes should be at the very heart of logic.
the concept itself. So it's not just about like the word we use, the mental image that we have, but the inherent understanding embedded within that.
Precisely. And he argues that a deep examination of these like, seemingly external thought frameworks, that they reveal their limitations and they kind of point us towards this concept as like their underlying truth. Therefore, the science of logic for Hegel, it becomes this process of reconstructing these thought frameworks that have been abstracted and fixed as like subjective forms, seemingly separate from the rich content they are meant to grasp.
So this leads us to this idea of like the beginning of science.
Yeah.
Right.
So Hegel seems to have a specific like view on how true scientific knowledge should start emphasizing this content's own reflection.
Right.
Can you explain what he means by that a little bit?
So traditionally, there's been this separation, right, between the content of what we know, the raw information, the material, and the form in which we know it, how we think about it, the structure. So the common idea was that this material just exists independently, and then our thought comes along and like imposes a structure or a form onto it.
Yeah.
So Hegel, he kind of flips this, right? He's saying that it's the content's own reflection, its own inner dynamism that initially brings forth and shapes what that content truly is.
So the content isn't just like passive stuff waiting to be molded by our thoughts. It has its own kind of inner logic or its own kind of inner something that is pushing it forward, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then he kind of introduces the roles of understanding and reason in this active process, right?
Right.
So understanding, this is the faculty that, identifies things. And it holds those identifications as like fixed and distinct. Reason, on the other hand, it operates on a higher level, right? It's both negative and dialectical, meaning it dissolves these fixed distinctions made by understanding. But it's also positive, right? Generating the universal principles that connect and comprehend the particular instances.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And then where does spirit fit into this whole interplay between understanding and reason?
So for Hegel, spirit represents this higher stage, right?
Right.
Than both understanding and reason as they're typically conceived of. Spirit has the ability to negate and dissolve differences, right?
Yeah.
Much like dialectical reason. But it also has this positive power to restore the initial simplicity. Now, as a richer, more concrete universality. So it's not just returning to a simple, undifferentiated unity. It's a unity that has been enriched through this whole process of differentiation and dissolution.
It sounds like a very active, almost like living process. And Hegel, he actually refers to it as the spiritual movement, doesn't he?
Yes. He describes this as the spiritual movement, which he sees as the imminent or like the inherent development of the concept itself. And he says that this is the absolute method of cognition and also the immanent soul of the content, he says. So he asserts that only through this self-constructing path can philosophy truly become an objective, demonstrable science, which he kind of, attempted to show in the phenomenology of spirit.
Now, Hegel also touches on this problem with starting science with something that seems concrete.
Right.
What's the issue he sees there?
So he argues that beginning with something that appears concrete in science, it lacks the necessary demonstration of how the various characteristics or determinations it contains are actually connected and combined. If you just start with a really complex idea, you haven't really logically shown how its different parts necessarily fit together.
Yeah, so the true starting point for science needs to be something more fundamental, something less complex, something very basic.
Exactly. So he believes that the true beginning must be a simple immediacy, like something utterly basic, without any presupposed internal structure, from which all subsequent movement and determination kind of naturally unfolds.
And this leads us to this famous Hegelian triad, right?
Right.
Of being, nothing, and becoming.
Yeah.
How does he approach these most fundamental, I don't even know how to describe them.
I know. The most fundamental concept.
Yeah.
So the everyday assumption, right, that Hegel points out is that being and nothing are completely and obviously distinct, and there's no clearer separation imaginable, right?
Right.
Yet he says that it's surprisingly difficult, even impossible, to really articulate what this fundamental distinction actually consists of.
Yeah.
Pure being and pure nothing, they're equally indeterminate. They lack any specific qualities or characteristics. So the distinction that we think we perceive, he says, often relies on our subjective intention or perspective. which doesn't really belong at this most basic level of analysis.
So if both of them are so like utterly empty and undefined,
Right.
where does this apparent difference like between being and nothing even come from? Like, why do we think they're different?
Right. So Hegel proposes a third, a more dynamic element in which both being and nothing have their existence, and that is becoming. So in this process of becoming, being, and nothing are present as distinct.
Right.
Becoming only happens because they are different.
Yeah.
But they don't have an independent existence. You know? Their reality is found in this continuous interplay. So becoming, therefore, is the unifying movement that simultaneously preserves the distinctness of being and nothing,
Right.
while also transcending their like simple opposition. So he would say that it sublates them.
Yeah. Becoming as like the dynamic connection, right, between this seemingly absolute opposition of being and nothing. That's such a powerful image and a powerful idea. Now, Hegel also discusses this concept of abstraction.
Yeah.
And he specifically references Jacobi. What's the key point he's making there?
So Hegel is highlighting Jacobi's recognition that abstraction, whether it's the idea of pure space, pure time, or pure consciousness, like the isolated I, he's saying that these are ultimately a kind of non-entity. And Jacobi argued that these kinds of radical abstractions, they actually hinder any real synthesis, any genuine movement towards understanding something concrete and real. And Hegel agrees with him. He says that the kind of synthesis he's interested in isn't just like an external joining together of already defined concepts. He's looking for what he calls an immanent synthesis, a synthesis a priori. So a unity of these like distinct elements that exist in and through itself, you know, and becoming, again, it serves as this prime example of this inherent unity, right, of being and nothing.
And Jacobi raised questions about how this initial indeterminateness, how can it ever lead to something determinate, to something specific, right? Like, how do we get from there to here?
Exactly. So Jacobi specifically asks, like, how does this pure indeterminate I ever acquire specific content? You know, how does sheer indeterminateness become determinate? So Hegel is critiquing a kind of reflection that just presupposes fixed categories. And he's arguing that this approach actually prevents us from truly answering such fundamental questions. And he also mentions Jacobi's like very vivid description of the attempt to grasp the abstraction of pure space by radically forgetting all sensory experience, like aiming for a completely detached and pure intuition.
So it's this very act of abstracting away from the concrete experience that makes it so difficult to understand how concrete reality actually arises.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about these concepts of being in itself and being for other.
Yeah.
How do these relate to our understanding of something?
So in the context of understanding something, being is initially being in itself, which Hegel clarifies as this kind of self-reference, like a self-equality that's understood as the non-being of otherness. So it defines itself by what it inherently is, right? Not by what it is not.
Yeah.
So similarly, non-being within this initial unity, it's not just general non-existence, but it's being for others. So it exists in relation to something else, right? Its being is mediated by its connection to what it is not.
Okay, so something is fundamentally defined both by like its internal identity, right?
Sure.
And by its relationship to what lies outside of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. And this kind of like dynamic interplay continues as Hegel explores the concepts of the finite and the infinite. So what's the central tension that he's examining there?
So for Hegel, the finite, it defines itself through a connection, like a kind of inherent potential. He uses the term ought. So it's a sense of what it's meant to be and a limit, right? A restriction that prevents it from like fully realizing that potential. So this ought has like an inner self-sufficiency, you know, a sense of its own inherent nature that stands against negation, but it's also internally constrained. So the infinite then is presented as the nothingness of this finite limit, right? It's the in itself that the finite ought to be, the fully realized potential. But it's also a realized ought, an affirmative self-referring being in its own right.
Okay, so the infinite is it's like the complete realization of the finite's inherent potential.
Yeah.
Like the removal of all its limitations.
That's part of the picture, yeah. But Hegel also points out that this infinite, often conceived of as like the negation of the finite, it tends to be like understood in opposition to it. And the finite, even while theoretically being overcome, you know, in the infinite, still appears to persist in its limited form. So this leads to what he calls the alternating determination of the finite and the infinite. Each is defined in relation to the other. They're inseparable, yet they seem to be absolutely distinct, with each containing the other within its own definition.
Okay, that sounds like a kind of like perpetual cycle.
Yeah.
Like a back and forth without resolution. And Hegel actually criticizes this idea of progress to infinity in this context, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He views it as like an unresolved contradiction.
Yeah.
Where these inherently connected concepts, like finite and infinite, are treated as like independent entities engaged in a never-ending pursuit of each other.
They're chasing each other.
Yeah. He argues that this kind of progress, it acknowledges the contradiction, but it doesn't actually resolve it or offer a deeper understanding.
Yeah. Okay, so this infinite progress doesn't really lead to a true grasp of infinity.
No.
Okay. So let's move on to the concepts of quantity and quality. So what's the fundamental distinction that Hegel draws between these two?
So Hegel states that being for itself completes qualitative being, making it, in a sense, infinite in its own like defined nature. So quality is its immediate determinateness. It's what something fundamentally is. Quantity, in contrast, is the determinateness that has become indifferent to this specific being. It's a limit that is also no limit. A being for itself that is absolutely identical to being for another. Think of quality as like the what and quantity as like the how much. And he then introduces continuous magnitude, which exists as like an unbroken connection, and discrete magnitude, which exists as like separate individual units as the primary forms of quantity.
Okay, so continuous and discrete, like it's like a smooth line versus like a collection of individual points or something like that.
So that's a helpful analogy.
Wait.
Yeah. So continuous magnitude is this self-same connectedness that endlessly like posits itself without negation. It's an inherent unity. Discrete magnitude is the existence of separate, distinct units. However, Hegel emphasizes that even these discrete units, they share a commonality, a shared being that makes them ones.
And how do these two forms of quantity, continuous and discrete, lead to the emergence of what he calls quanta?
So when a defined limit, right, encompasses like multiple individual units of discrete quantity, it effectively treats them as unified within that boundary. So this process makes this distinction between continuous and discrete magnitude like less significant, or rather it makes a limit to the pure continuity of either. And in this, both continuous and discrete magnitude, they transition into being quanta. So quanta is essentially quantity with a specific determination, a specific limit.
And the complete determination of a quantum is number, right? Like that's how we finally get to a specific number.
Exactly. So quantum, with its general limit, it finds its complete and precise determination in number. And Hegel then further divides quantum into extensive quantum, where the limit is defined by like the extent or the number of existing units. Mm-hmm. And then intensive quantum, which is also known as like degree, which arises when the simple existence of these units transitions into a more active being for itself, like a degree of intensity. So intensive quantum is inherently self-referential, but also subject to like external measurement.
Okay, so extensive is about how many, and intensive is about like how much intensity.
Yeah.
Like the temperature or the brightness of something.
That's a good way to understand it. Yeah. So Hegel also briefly discusses how number itself arises from the process of combining individual units, right? What we call counting or numbering, and how our specific number systems are ultimately like somewhat arbitrary. Yeah. Based on the fundamental unit that we choose to count.
So no, this next section I think is really, really fascinating. It's Hegel's critique of directly applying mathematics to philosophy.
Right.
So what's his main argument against that?
Well, so Hegel argues that while mathematical formulas, they might represent thoughts and conceptual distinctions in a symbolic way, the actual meaning and justification of these formulas, they must first be indicated, determined, and established within the realm of philosophy itself. So philosophy, when exploring concrete sciences, should draw its logical framework from its own domain of logic. It shouldn't just borrow it wholesale from mathematics.
So mathematics can be like a useful tool for philosophy, but it can't like replace the fundamental work of philosophical thinking. Precisely. So he sees this, relying on these mathematical frameworks as a substitute for genuine philosophical inquiry, as a sign of like a lack of philosophical depth. So the mere application of such, borrowed formulas, is an external and ultimately superficial operation. You need to understand the underlying value and meaning of these formulas before you apply them, and only rigorous philosophical thought can provide this essential understanding. And he actually says that logic itself refines these formulas, clarifies their meaning, and alone provides their true justification, their sense, and inherent value.
That's a pretty strong stance.
It is.
Let's move on to the concept of intensive magnitude or degree.
Right.
So how does that relate back to extensive quantum? So the defined limit of extensive quantum, right, which had its concrete existence as this self-external number of units, it transitions into a simple unified determinateness, becoming intensive magnitude or degree. So degree is a determinate magnitude. It's a quantum with a specific limit. But it's not simply an aggregate of individual units at that level. It's a plurality that has been gathered into like the singular determination. It's an existence that has, in a sense, like returned into being for itself as a unified intensity.
Okay, so if we say something has a temperature of like 10 degrees, the 10, it's not just a sum of 10 individual degree units.
Right.
It represents a single unified level of intensity containing that numerosity within it.
Exactly. So the number expresses the specific level of determinateness, but not as a mere collection of separate units at that exact level of intensity. You know, it's a singular intensified quality.
Right. And Hegel revisits this idea of infinite progress in this section as well. Does his criticism of it change at all here?
No, his fundamental critique remains the same. So he reiterates that infinite progress is essentially an expression of an unresolved contradiction, not a genuine path to resolution. So the apparent continuity between the successive determinations in the progress, it creates this illusion of an eventual union or completion, but it ultimately amounts to a perpetual generation of the infinite without ever actually reaching it. The supposed beyond, or the infinite itself, it simply becomes another finite quantum, another defined limit in the sequence.
It's like chasing a finish line that keeps moving further away, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He also brings in Kant's concept of the sublime at this point.
Right.
Why did he bring that in?
So Hegel mentions Kant's view that experiences of wonder, the external sublime and profound reverence, which is like the inner sublime, they can certainly stimulate intellectual inquiry, but they can't ultimately replace its inherent limitations. So Kant believed that these feelings, while powerful, are ultimately unsatisfying for reason, as reason cannot simply like stop at these subjective feelings or accept the indeterminate beyond, or the sheer emptiness as ultimate explanations.
And this idea of infinite progression also shows up in the realm of morality, according to Hegel.
Yeah, it does. So he discusses how the ideal of a perfect alignment, right, between our individual will and the universal moral law. It's sometimes transposed into a concept of unattainable infinite progress in moral development. So the underlying idea is that this very unattainability, it paradoxically provides a sense of ongoing reliance and consolation. However, Hegel argues that this reliance often rests on this unacknowledged assumption of a fundamental disproportion between our finite will and the infinite demands of the moral law, effectively making the law this ever-receding ideal.
So it's like we're constantly striving for like moral perfection, but we can never really achieve it in this way.
Right.
Okay. So let's delve into Kant's first antinomy concerning time and space. What's the core argument of the thesis there that Hegel presents?
Okay, so the thesis states that the world has a beginning in time, and in space it is also enclosed within limits. So the proof concerning time, it argues that if we assume the world had no beginning in time, then an infinite series of past world states would have already had to elapse to reach the present moment. But an infinite series, right? It can never be completed through like a successive process of synthesis. Therefore, an infinitely elapsed world series is impossible, logically necessitating a beginning in time.
That's a mind-bending way to think about infinity for sure. Now Hegel he talks about quantum's return to quality. What does that signify in his system?
So Hegel explains that even the initial negation of quality in order to